We don't have any good billionaires. How do I know? Because there are plenty of things that those billionaires could be doing with their money that would benefit the world, and they aren't. Today, let's talk about art. I'm Botanical Lich, and here's the bee. The arts are criminally undersupported in the United States in any case, but with AI breathing down their necks, there is an additional need for young and new artists to be able to have the space and freedom to explore their mediums without needing to worry about their financial situations. If I were a good billionaire, I feel like this would be a good use for my money. Why art? Art creates and enhances communities. Art is enjoyable. It allows people to escape their current thoughts and situations, drawing them into different worlds and possibilities. Art is pro-social. It encourages examining and appreciating other people's emotions, cultures, and opinions. These two things come together and create communities around art. Discussions, the sharing of ideas, and more art springs from the appreciation of art. With the looming specter of generative AI, and the seeming incapability of the government, large businesses, or the courts to do anything about it, it is more important than ever that young and upcoming artists are able to be supported while they refine their crafts. There is a question as to how much work artists are actually losing to AI, but I'm not going to speculate on that here, other than saying that any amount of work that is being taken by an algorithm is too much. Especially when that algorithm is quite possibly stealing your own work in order to create a facsimile of your art. One of the major problems that artists, and people who think about such things, will point out about AI is that if you start replacing entry-level artists with AI algorithms, you cut off paths for entry-level artists to become established and experienced artists. This compounds the problem of AI being iterative. That is, that it can only create things that are similar to things that it has been trained on. So with fewer established artists, you have less evolution in the art environment, and a stagnation in forms and styles of art. It's the end of history, but for art. So, art is good, and at risk. What can a good billionaire do about that? Supporting artists monetarily would be a good course of action to combat that risk. Unfortunately, any project where you distribute limited resources will inherently have some questions to answer. Who am I to decide who deserves to be funded as a striving artist? What counts as art? How do you keep bad actors out of systems like these? Hopefully, I'll be able to answer these questions as I go through my ideas for starting a collective. Let's start by taking a look at a few different options of how we could structure an art collective. Starting with the selection process. For any collective that I establish, I would try to distance myself from the selection process. Perhaps some recipients would be chosen by mid-level artists, those who still remember the pain of trying to support themselves off their art, and some would be chosen by peer lottery, assuming that they meet some sort of minimum portfolio standards or something. That way, we could mitigate some biases to art styles and messages, which I think is important. As a billionaire, I would be able to commission the creation of art that I enjoyed, or art that supports messages that I like at any time. This art collective would be created for the purpose of supporting art in general, not art that I enjoyed or art that I agreed with, just ensuring that human art remains a staple of our existence. Once it was established, it might be helpful if the members could be partially responsible for evaluating candidates. This would hopefully protect the ideas of what is considered art from becoming too stale. It's important to point out that the intent is that art would have a wide definition, from writing to murals and graffiti to asset design for digital projects. Any program that provides something needs some way to select their participants. Rather than any sort of skill or talent standards for my collective, the restrictions would have more to do with the creation of art as a passion and existing profits. Someone who is already making over $30,000 a year from their art wouldn't need the same support as someone who has passion but hasn't found an audience yet. An essay, short video, or sufficiently explanatory art project about what an artist would do if they didn't have to worry about living expenses might be enough to meet the requirements to get an artist into the lottery. Similarly, if an artist garnered a sufficiently large audience, or started being able to support themselves off the money they earned with their art, they would no longer need the full extent of support that the programs provided. Now that we have a plan for how we would be gathering participants for the collective, we can look at a couple different options of how to structure it, and each one's benefits and drawbacks. The simplest option that I can see is to just send artists who are selected for the program a stipend. This would result in very little overhead costs, and allow artists to remain in their communities. Hopefully it's become apparent that I'm trying to protect against monolithic thought. That is, I'm actively trying to avoid creating a group where specific ideas are accepted and others are rejected. By allowing artists to stay in their communities, it would keep those artists anchored in their own cultures and the real world. Unfortunately, supporting several disparate individuals is much more expensive than supporting a large group that has been gathered into one space. $20,000 can't necessarily provide adequate living conditions for people living across the United States. For some, it might be enough, but for others it would be severely lacking. I say $20,000 because $20,000 is a liberal estimate of the cost of a year's worth of room and board at college. In other words, an alternative to a stipend would be to provide college-style living conditions for members of the collective. An assumed cost of $20,000 would provide an admittedly small, shared living and sleeping space, water, electricity, and other utilities. In addition, these spaces would be augmented and with maintained bathrooms and public spaces. For an artist collective, these places would likely include studio spaces, where sculpting, painting, and other physical arts could be practiced. Basic levels of equipment could be provided for shared use at much lower costs than if each person needed to purchase their own equipment. This would also allow volunteers and invited experts to come and address large groups of less established artists and be available for questions and consultation. On the other hand, a physical location would be much more likely to create uniform thought, which is something that we're trying to avoid. Art generally has motivation behind it, and for someone to be motivated, they generally have to have a desire for some sort of change. As such, art is generally revolutionary in some way, frequently advocating for progressive changes like more equal rights and acceptance, but it can also be regressive, depicting the suppression of others to create more possibilities for the in-group. In a space that is somewhat isolated, like a campus or a collective, it is more likely that ideas will become part of an environment, and that individuals that don't agree with those ideas would be isolated. There are questions as to whether this would actually be a problem. My instinct is to say that suppressive and regressive ideas should be disallowed at an executive level. But issues come up to where those lines are drawn. If someone paints a same-sex couple being assaulted, that could be taken as support for those actions. But it could also be argued that it's a surreal depiction of the reality of everyday life for those people. Or it could be part of a series of images that depict a full story, of which the assault was a pivotal moment. How can an arbiter be sure that they will interpret art correctly, let alone that they would not eventually lose track of what is regressive and what is acceptable? You would think, then, that it would be much better to allow the members of the collective to decide what the culture of the collective should be. However, what if the majority of the collective decides to act against individuals for holding ideas that are considered regressive by them, but are accepted in general society? Surely you would need some greater form of authority that could disincentivize that behavior. Tangent! The Good-Tator. I have always been intrigued by the idea of the good dictator, maybe more well known as the idea of the good king or the just king. That is to say, I am interested in the idea of a quote-unquote good man in a position of close to absolute power, even if there aren't that many realistic situations where a good person would find themselves in that position. Too many circumstances work against them. It is frequently easier to force yourself into such a situation using underhanded and cruel tactics, and it is unlikely that someone who is inheriting such a position would be untainted by the actions and ideas of those who are surrounding them. Leaving realism aside, it is an interesting thought exercise to try to imagine a good person in a position of absolute power. How far can the exercise of power be stretched before it becomes despotic? What compromises does a good person make to get the outcome they desire? Do the ends justify the means? Does the actions of one leader for good create a precedent for the next to do the same things, but for greed? There's probably enough to write an entire video series on the idea. I find myself thinking of the good dictator because this situation is similar. A powerful force swooping down, establishing rules and doctrine as if they are some arbiter of truth. To some of you, what I'm describing might sound like a scam or a cult. And you're absolutely right. Many scams and cults bring people in by describing a situation that is beneficial to the participants, and then trapping or enticing them into situations that they are incapable of escaping on their own. Unfortunately, the most I have to go on is, trust me, bro, my current incapability of actually enacting these ideas, and the addition of time restraints on members' length of participation. I do think that the difference between a cult or a scam and an organization that reflexively stays beneficial to its members is good contracts and joint ownership. This can be achieved by creating a true collective, with no majority owner. A democratic participant-run system is much less likely to become monolithic, or to allow its members to be taken advantage of. It would also be harder for a person or group to take over the organization and turn it into a predatory force. By including contract rules that promise good treatment, members can protect themselves from abusive relationships within the group. A lot of you are thinking, yeah, because no one's been screwed over by a contract before. And I hear you. All the time. In my head. It's like the comments on these videos are beamed straight into my head in real time. Why would I even want to watch this? Is the most common one. In any case, the only defense that I can offer is that I could send my base contract to internet lawyers and journalists and have them evaluate it for their audiences. Then you could compare the contract a group gives you with the ones that they evaluated and come to a more informed decision. Struggling artists needing to hire a lawyer to go over their contract with a group that's supposed to be helping them is kind of counterproductive after all. I often find myself focusing on protecting against possible flaws in these scenarios. So let's go over what could be possible. If we're willing to spend $100 million on creating and sustaining an art collective, we could spend $30 million on setting up a compound, which is the approximate cost of a 500-bed dormitory. Then we have $70 million to spend on 500 people, $20,000 a year to pay for their room and board costs. This would be enough to support a full population for 7 years, and that's assuming that the organization didn't receive any outside support or donations from graduating members. Every additional $100 million that was spent could double the population, or increase the operating duration for about 10 years. Based on my assumptions, dedicating $100 million, you could realistically provide 1,300 artists a chance to refine their crafts and find an audience for their art over the course of 7 years, with more than 100 of them graduating, or ending up being able to support themselves on their art income alone, and allowing many others to find a dedicated audience for their art if they wish to continue their art part-time. 1,300 people might not sound like a lot of people, and 100 is even less, but we are fighting a future where it may become incredibly difficult or even impossible for individual artists to gather enough of an audience to support their production of art, let alone themselves. We're fighting against a world where only the well-off have any ability to create or propagate art. Any sort of collective or support group is going to be a tricky situation, and there will be pros and cons in any implementation. But I think this is a reasonable way to make sure that support is going to those who deserve it, and protects against AI grifters and people who have no interest in the art and its meaning, taking money out of the pockets of those who I actually want to support. So, what are rich people doing? I'd like to say that billionaires and the rich are using their money to control the arts and the artists by paying them to make regressive art, or art that supports the idea of billionaires being smart and moral inherently. And there is some of that. We just had Melania come out, which is a puff piece about the rich and powerful wife of the president. More so, however, I think the rich are simply funding AI projects. I don't think it's to directly crush independent artists and dissenting ideas and art. I think it's literally because they do not understand the power that art has. They don't realize that art can affect people on an emotional and spiritual level because it doesn't affect them that way anymore. It's less that they're pressing their heels into the necks of artists on purpose, and more that they don't care where they step. Call to action. For today's call to action, I want you to support an artist in your life. If you have a friend or family member who creates commercial art, ask to see it, and see if there's anything that they make that you'd like to purchase. If you know someone that makes content, share that content with your other friends or on social media. If you don't know any artists in your personal life, then purchase something from one that you know you like, either a local artist or online. The smaller the creator, the better. I invite you to expand upon my ideas of an art collective in the comments, or to link your favorite small artists or small creators. Like and subscribe if you too think that art is inherently valuable and should be supported. And I'll see you the next time that I rise from the crypt.